Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. In the 1980s, the Association of Theological Schools in North America recognised that while its student population was becoming more and more culturally diverse, its teaching paradigm was not. It was very monocultural. And so they decided that they would enter into a project of trying to discover what impact cultural diversity could have on what was taught in classrooms, how it was taught, and why. The project turned years long, and in the 1990s, the association declared a decade of globalisation. At the end of that decade, 2 white senior statesmen were asked to review the years and how they'd gone. And their conclusion was this: it's a whole lot easier to describe what we hope for than it is to do it. Halfway through that decade, a Korean man who had migrated to the United States and taught and lived there for quite a long time wrote an article and made this observation of those years. If those who are in the centre of the conversation and in power only ever talk to those who, like them, are in the centre, and don't pay attention to those who are located on the margins of the conversation, nothing will ever change. In other words, those who are in power, the insiders, if they only ever talk and consult with those who look like them, sound like them, and think like them, the possibility for change will be jinxed. Now, I don't know about you, but across my life, I've experienced quite a lot of church meetings. And it's quite remarkable, isn't it, how often different perspectives are not always really quite welcome. And some meetings that I've sat in, it has seemed like they are actually really welcome, but when you walk out of the meeting, nothing ever changes. There are the odd meetings where different perspectives have simply not been invited into the room. Now, I think it's a human default setting, because I know I'm guilty of this too, that we like to clump with those who think like us because it's just so much more comfortable and a whole lot easier, and you get things done. But if the church is going to have a future and push into that missional call to be salt and light in our world, then we need to be working really hard against the temptation in us all to insider referencing, and to be people who delight in welcoming those with different perspectives from ourselves and the potential creativity and possibility that those different perspectives might offer. Albert Einstein once said this: "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." Now, I took that Korean American man's observation seriously, and in my own research I went and interviewed 40 people who embody cultural diversity, either because their heritage, in their family heritage, several different cultures have intermarried, or they've lived a life where they've migrated or lived in several countries and immersed themselves in cultures and languages where they have lived, or are Indigenous people living under a dominant cultural paradigm. And as I listened to these people, I heard them offering 4 practices for helping us who need to work against that temptation to insider referencing. And here they are, because the question is, how can we break this? How can we work against this? Well, here we go. The first one was they were suggesting we need to become people who are genuinely curious about everybody else, who care about people's identity and who will listen to their story and hear it all the way through, because in the midst of that, often in the midst of tears shed or laughter shed, we will start developing relationship and appreciation for one another. They also said that it's really important to commit ourselves to intentionally seeking to listen to those whose voices are silenced. This might be the introvert in the room who hardly ever says anything, but when we have asked them a question, we've realised they're incredibly insightful. But it's also those people amongst us who we simply have never asked. We've ignored them, we've neglected them, whether that's in our churches or whether that's in our wider communities. So we need to be listening to the silenced voices. We also need to be people who dare ourselves to, on a regular basis, step into environments and experiences that will break apart what we know and what is our understanding and our way of viewing the world into potentially something much bigger. It's often a very uncomfortable place to be. We don't like going there, but it's good for us. And if we're doing these things, then we will become, or we should also commit to becoming people who are dealing in justice, with compassion, and not in ways that are mono, as in one-directional, I'm doing this for you, but that recognise that transformation is a mutual exercise, and we're in the business of being changed as well. Why might we do this work? Is there anything in Scripture that helps us? Well, the really interesting thing is that so often across the biblical story, God uses outsiders, those with very different perspectives, to effect change amongst God's people or in family lines. So let me tell you about three. Moses. Okay, he's born Hebrew, but at the age of 2, as we know, is adopted into the Egyptian royal household, which means he'll be learning another language, another worldview, another religion, and he's doing it from a position of power and privilege. Stephen, in the book of Acts, tells us that when Moses is about 40 years old, he has that incident where he sees an Egyptian overseer badly whipping a Hebrew slave. He kills the Egyptian overseer and then flees into the desert, frightened of the consequences, because he's now a murderer, another kind of an outsider. Well, he turns up in the desert and spends 40 years there, marries into a priestly Midianite family, and again, another language, worldview, religious way of being. And you know, by the time Moses encounters the burning bush, and God calls this man to be the leader to take God's people out of slavery in Egypt into the promised land, he's had 78 years of experience of being an outsider. Isn't it interesting that this outsider guy on so many levels will help to shape the culture and the law of the people of Israel? They'll complain about it, but it's his job. And he's still someone highly revered within many faith traditions today. A family story. Man, woman, 2 sons. There's a famine in their home, so they go to Moab, because the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. The boys marry 2 Moabite girls, the men all then die, and then the woman decides that she's going to go home, and she tells her daughter-in-laws that they should stay in Moab. But Ruth says, no, I'm coming with you, and then delivers a quite remarkable speech to her mother-in-law that evidences the character qualities of the God bitter Naomi is supposed to be believing in. Ruth, a Moabite, foreigner, outsider, preaching God to her own mother-in-law. And there's a nice piece in the story, isn't there, where an insider opens his home to Ruth and marries her. And so she becomes part of the genealogy of Jesus, an outsider grafted into God's own story. And then my third example is Saul, who become Paul. Saul is born to Jewish parents of the tribe of Benjamin, but in Tarsus, a metropolitan Roman city within the borders of modern-day Turkey. He is second gen. So for those of you for whom this is your identity story, you'll know the complexities of insider-outsiderishness and how they might play out in any given situation. He leans into his Jewish identity as he heads to Israel to be educated in that, becomes a fanatic in his own words, and ends up persecuting the small group of followers of the way. Thing is, Jesus confronts him on the Damascus road, and a wee while later, Paul's knocking on the door of those followers asking to join them. And, you know, God will use this man to be somebody who will bring the small group of people out of being a sect of Judaism to becoming a global faith. All stories of outsiders, and God is in the habit of bringing change through people who hold very different perspectives from those around them. And it's really important that we are people who are open to those whom God might bring amongst us, who we would consider outsiders, but who in fact might hold the next ideas for who we can be as church and as the people of God. I want to tell you something from a slightly different angle. At the moment, I am doing research for the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa in New Zealand. I've just finished talking to 55 ministers across the country. And among a number of things that they're talking about, it's becoming quite apparent that the size of the gospel that many Christians espouse is far too small. We are reducing God to a box of our own making, framed by our favourite texts, the ones that we like, that make us feel comfortable, maybe a list of do's and don'ts, faith that maybe was formed in our Bible class years that could have been decades ago, or in Sunday school that we haven't really ever developed, and we miss out so much of the biblical story. And what's happening is it's coming out in our behaviour. We're becoming, some of us, hopefully no one in this room, introverted, bigoted, consumerist, and with a tendency to being self-serving. Christopher Wright has said that we need to be people who know the whole story that we are part of, to be people continually